Rebirth of communism has existed for over 2 years, and now of the first questions about our seat's name was, why do you wanna rebuild the communist movement when there already exists a communist party in Poland? Nowadays, almost nobody asks the questions since the
KPP, revisionism, nationalism, antisemitism. Rebirth of communism has existed for over 2 years now, and one of the first questions about our site's name was, why do you wanna rebuild the communist movement when there already exists a communist party in Poland? Nowadays, almost nobody asks that question since the KPP and other sects trying to compete with us are far behind us in regards to theory, propaganda and organizing. Honestly, we don't really have to discredit nor fight the KPP. It compromises itself both by the constant inactivity and by making multiple pathetic statement. We don't have to look really deep. It's enough to remind the statement from a few months ago in which they were encouraging help for the failing Polish entrepreneurs. Both young Poles interested in Marxism and the Polish workers who try to organize some communist activity in their workplaces see their future in the force which treats the legacy of the communist movement seriously. That is in Rebirth of Communism. It shows in the popularity of our YouTube channel, our portal and the active community on YouTube, Facebook and Discord. It was the commitment of Polish communists which made it possible to make all these projects like a library of Marxist audiobooks, lectures popularizing Marxism and the history of the proletarian movement and the activity of the anti-capitalist front, which has been going on for several months now. This article is addressed to the readers from abroad who heard that the KPP is repressed in Poland and because of that, motivated by communist internationalism, solidarized with the KPP. I will try to explain to them what I think of the KPP and why I am not a member of it. First of all, we have to state the sad fact that the European communist movement has been in crisis for over 60 years. That crisis is a consequence of degeneration of the Communist Party of Soviet Union after the 20th Congress and the famous speech by Khrushchev, which marked the beginning of the de-Stalinization in the USSR. Another consequence of changes in the CPSU was the revisionist evolution of other European communist parties, which gave up trying to start a communist revolution and shifted more and more to the right over the years, basically becoming social democratic. Our portal's name means striving to rebuild a revolutionary communist movement which did exist in Europe at the time when the Communist International was forming. Today there is hardly any revolutionary communist movement in Europe, and it will never appear if we will be accepting compromising the communist ideas by revisionist traitors. So much for the shift to the Euro-communism. Now it's fitting to say some words about the evolution of parties like the PZPR, Polska Zjednoczona Partia Robotnicza, United Workers' Party of Poland, and others from the socialist bloc, even though their degeneration largely resembles the decay of Western communist parties. Their decay was far more advanced and far more compromising for the communist movement. We should note the simple fact that even though the Lenin-era Bolshevik party was being attacked by internal counter-revolution and capitalist countries, it managed to win that fight and start the construction of socialism in the USSR. On the other hand, the process of reverting to capitalism in the Eastern Europe was almost bloodless. The PZPR wasn't overthrown by the forces of imperialism. It was the PZPR itself that started the process of reintroducing capitalist relations in Poland. The first capitalist reforms were carried out before Solidarity took power, Wilczek and Rakowski's reforms. The most important faces of Polish capitalism, like Leszek Balcerowicz, are former members of the PZPR. The former party elites got their properties from privatization and were a seat of the Polish bourgeoisie. With the exception of Romania, in other countries such processes looked similar. The military actions that took place in the USSR or Yugoslavia were mostly ethnic conflicts. Nobody or almost nobody was fighting the capitalist counter-revolution. It's hard to understand the wimpiness of the KPP and other pseudo-communist parties in the former socialist bloc without understanding the shape of the ruling parties just before the counter-revolution. They were mostly parties of power, which was a magnet for opportunists. In the time of Marx or Lenin, just being a member of revolutionary parties often resulted in repressions, and that was a natural sieve which allowed Lenin to use the word vanguard about the Bolshevik party. They were the most ideological members of the revolutionary intelligentsia or the most conscious members of the proletariat. One can't possibly use the word vanguard about the parties based on the disintegration of ruling parties in the former socialist bloc. I could bring up many members of the KPRF who have nothing to do with the revolutionary proletariat. One can find quite some small and big businessmen in that party. Although the main topic of this text is the KPP, so in order to talk about the moral politic, let's say, of its members, one should talk a bit about the PZPR. According to my analysis, People's Republic of Poland was the least socialist of all the members of the socialist bloc. When the Second World War was still going on, Polish reactionaries and fascists started military activities against the newly forming socialist power in Poland. The cursed soldiers were crushed, but even in the 40s, nationalists or even outright anti-communists were a big part of the new power apparatus. For example, Józef Kuraś, Ogień, who was carrying out anti-communist activities while being a member of the UB, Department of Security, a Polish equivalent of the NKWD. Nationalist, anti-Semitic, anti-socialist and anti-Soviet views were always present in the PZPR. That's a topic for a separate article, but in short, it could be said that reactionary views were rightfully repressed in 1948-1956, tolerated in 1956-1968, and after the anti-Semitic purge in the 1968 become dominant. Edward Gierek, the leader of the party and the state in the 70s, was talking about socialism only on international meetings. His speeches to Poles were a populist, patriotic, much with a social democratic undertone. In the Gierek era, there was a massive surge of members into the PZPR and many additional opportunists joined that party. It was in the Gierek era that the later founders of the KPP joined the PZPR. The Gierek epoch was basically a Polish variant of a market socialism, which later was somewhat mimicked by Deng in China. Gierek tied the Polish economy to the situation on the world markets. Because of credits in foreign banks and using Western technology, the capitalist crisis of 1979 and sanctions put on Poland in 1981 one plunged the economy into a prolonged crisis lasting basically the whole decade of the 80s. Socialism, which in the Stalin era proved its economic superiority over the capitalist countries, became compromised by Gierek, and the economic problems which occurred in the 80s led to compromising the socialist ideology in the eyes of many Poles. That was when the famous lines and empty stores shelves appeared. There began to emerge a black market whose pillar were companies made by Polish immigrants in the FRG and the USA, which were tolerated by the power apparatus, especially the force departments. That's how capitalism was born in the Eastern Europe near the end of the 80s. It had a mafia-like character, and its pillar were high-ranking members of the PZPR. During that era, most of new members were careerists who very well knew that membership in the party means an opportunity to get rich. Such people decided to reintroduce the capitalist relations, and nobody was defending socialism. Some members of the dissolved PZPR started ZKP, Union of Polish Communist Proletariat, which existed in the Polish political scene in the 90s. Aside from the ZKP, there was also the Association of Polish Marxists, made by Marxist academic activists who were threatened by purges in Polish universities. In the time of its inception, the ZKP consisted of several thousand people. It was around 1,000 of the PZPR, which shows how little Marxists were there. Unfortunately, the party's demographic profile didn't resemble the revolutionary organization we know from around the world. The socialist movement, inspired to this day, inspires mainly youth. Marx and Engels got involved in the communist movement when they were young. We also see such a scheme in the revolutionary movement of the Russian student in the 1870s and in the Cuban Revolution. On the other hand, members of the ZKP proletariat were quite old and thus quite politically passive and not very courageous. Several thousand members is quite an impressive number, but good luck trying to find traces of street activity of Polish communists. Political transformation, destruction of public health care, and mass impoverishment of the Polish society completed the work. Every issue of the Dawn, Brzask newspaper contained obituaries, and the group of communist pensioners started to crumble up. Those circles also get divided, and two new parties emerged: Polish Socialist Workers' Party and the Communist Party of Poland, KPP. 18 years ago, in 2002, when KPP was getting formed, the veterans of the PZPR were numerous enough to gather the required 1,000 signatures to form a party. The demographic process didn't stop too, and more obituaries were getting published in Dawn. Eventually it started getting issued more and more rarely, and since a few years it's been published mostly on the internet. I get that cameras from abroad have questions about results of the 30-year activity of Polish communists from the ZKP proletariat and the KPP. 30 years is a hell of long time to build a mass political movement, especially in a country like Poland, where during the first years of capitalist transformation we witnessed a capitalist barbarism on a mafia-like scale. What are the results? What does the KPP do? Firstly, the KPP was never independent politically. KPP has never made an election list, it has never organized a 1st of May or any other demonstration in Warsaw. Now we are getting to yet another sad part. The ZKP and the later KPP were always loyal to the SDRP, Social Democracy of the Polish Republic, and the SLD, Union of Democratic Left. After all, they knew each other since the times of the PZPR and, thanks to that, could use premise of the SLD. When I still lived in Poland, the KPP had organized its meeting on SLD premises. It was happening even in 2001, 2005, when the SLD was in power, carried on neoliberal economic policies, and the Polish government was serving US imperialists by sending troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. Polish pseudo-communists saw no issue in that. Later on, the KPP latched on to a left-wing anti-communist Piotr Ikonowicz. Ikonowicz since 40 years has organized 1st of May demonstration in Warsaw on which he speaks 80% of the time. Next, he lets members of satellite leftist organization talk for 2-3 minutes, and those 2 minutes of a public speech are basically the whole yearly activity of the KPP. Let me emphasize again, unlike the KPRF or the Greek KKI, Polish KPP never organized anything by itself. They always tell Social Democrats. Either the SLD or Ikonowicz and the Polish Workers' Party, which doesn't exist anymore, they briefly latched on it when the SLD sold its place. A member of the KPP was a candidate for the parliament from the left, Lewica, which was approved by the party and advertised in Dawn. What is the left politically? It's a coalition of social liberal SLD with Robert Biedroń, bourgeois party Spring, Wiosna, and the Social Democratic Together Party, Razem. Of course, that coalition defends capitalism. The left was the loudest voice in the parliament on the topic of helping Polish capitalists during the corona crisis. Robert Biedroń himself attended meetings of Polish entrepreneurs during the last elections campaign, and he delivers anti-communist speeches in the European Parliament. When it comes to foreign politics, the left is a servant of Western imperialism, and they very actively supported the attempted coup in Belarus in August 2020. That is the kind of people the KPP works with. I would sum up its activity as a lack of political independence and tailing the Social Democrats. That of course fully discredits the party as a communist party, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. Now we should talk a bit about the internet activism of KPP members. The things discussed above are a responsibility of the leadership, but I would also like to talk a bit about the members of the KPP who are also members of a nationalist organization, Grunwald. One of them is a former leader of the KPP, Marcin Adam. Grunwald is a place where in 1410 occurred a battle in which Polish-Lithuanian knights defeated the Teutonic Order. It's one of the biggest military successes of Poland, and every Pole is taught about it since early childhood. To understand the phenomenon of Grunwald, a nationalist group infiltrating a communist party, we have to go back to People Poland history once again, specifically to pre-war fascist Bolesław Piasecki, who worked with the People Power after the war. Piasecki and his circles supported the demographic changes which made Poland ethnically homogeneous. There emerged an exotic alliance of Polish fascism with the PZPR based on an anti-German nationalism. In the 80s, Piasecki circles scored an ideological win, and Wojciech Jaruzelski wasn't an internationalist or even socialist. It was in the Jaruzelski era that there emerged Grunwald, grouping many forms of Polish fascism. It was called Endokomuna, Ende Communism, a name derived from the name of Roman Dmowski's party's National Democracy. Jaruzelski himself, a godfather of Polish capitalism, is compromised, but in recent years, under the influence of right-wing propaganda scaring people with the invasion of barbaric migrants, there emerged an idea of reactivating Grunwald. Grunwald pretends to be a left-wing organization and refers to the legacy of People's Poland. Unfortunately, in reality, it's a fascistic organization scaring Poles with the influx of cheap labor power from the Ukraine and so on. Poroshenko coups of 2014 led to a crisis in the Ukraine and a later exodus of millions of Ukrainians. Many of them went to Poland. A communist party motivated by proletarian internationalism should try to cooperate with such immigrants, especially since most of them were physical workers, but Grunwald joined the common trend of instigating hatred against Ukrainians working in Poland and called them banderites. There was a Ukrainian fascist called Stefan Bandera. There really was a revival of fascism and the cult of Bandera in the Ukraine, but it's worth to highlight that most people immigrating out of the Ukraine are Russian-speaking, meaning the people oppressed by the Banderites. But even if there are some Banderites among the workers who migrated to Poland, one can't help but be irritated by the selectiveness and skipping the fact that the cult of the fascist cursed soldiers is widespread among Polish workers. Of course, the nationalism of those members of the KPP who are parts of Grunwald isn't unique to Poland. One can find a similar cesspool in the Russian KPRF or the French PRCF, which organized demonstrations of solidarity with the KPP next to the Polish embassy in Paris. Since I live in France, I can tell something about the PRCF political line. In short, it can be said that they contend with Marine Le Pen on the field of the anti-EU radicalism. The PRCF notoriously present themselves as heirs of Fourth Republic's first gouvernement, which contained 4 communist ministers. For the French working class, it was obviously the best period in the history of France, but PRCF doesn't talk about the country's imperialist character. It was that government which was responsible for the attempt and restoring the colonial domination in Indochina or repressions against Algerians, which started a long-lasting